just right off the bat, let me start with the two books in the back. And this isn't just shamelessly plugging the two books. I am. But this is also about giving a little bit of background of me and why I'm here today and what we're going to talk about. The two books relate to each other. The first book, Scorpion King, is about the history of America's, I call it the suicidal embrace of nuclear weapons, from their inception under FDR during the Second World War. Even though Truman was the one who used them, FDR conceived them, up and through the Trump administration. And to be frank, with the recent publication of the National Security Strategy just in October by the Biden administration, which included this nuclear posture review, there's no difference between the Trump administration nuclear posture and the Biden administration nuclear posture. If anybody thought that electing Joe Biden would change the way America views nuclear weapons and how we use nuclear weapons, it's not. So don't be worried that the book doesn't say through Biden. It says through Trump, but it continues. But the book talks about nuclear weapons, the arms race. It talks about why we got nuclear weapons, how we sought to envision, their use. Just to show you how crazy this is. When JFK, John F. Kennedy, became president, he was brought into the Pentagon to be read in on something called the Single Integrated Operation Plan, the PSYOP. Now, a couple years ago, I would have been shot if I said that out public because it was top secret. We don't talk about nuclear war plans. Now it's out there because we no longer call it PSYOP. I can't tell you what we call it because they'd shoot me. But we used to call it the PSYOP, and it's how we fight nuclear wars. And so Kennedy went down there, and the Pentagon proudly laid out the plan and said, this is it. If there's a nuclear conflict, this is the war plan. And Kennedy went, so basically we destroy the world. They said, yeah. He said, but that doesn't give me any options. I either don't use nuclear weapons and deal with the consequences, or I use nuclear weapons and we all die. They said, that's right, boss. That's the PSYOP for you. He said, that's insane. And he walked out and he turned to the aide next to him and he said, we call ourselves the human race. This can't be. We have to do it differently. He gave orders. I need options. And so they gave him options. When they briefed him on it the next time, he had 3 options. And he looked at it and he went, but if I use option A, we automatically transition to option B because option A isn't going to accomplish anything. That's right, boss. But you wanted options. But if I go to option B, I have to go to option C, which is general nuclear war. That's right, boss. But that's the one I told you I didn't want to do. That's nuclear war planning, boss. We go to nuclear war, we're going to use all our weapons. That's just the way it is. Every president that followed JFK had the same experience. Walking down to the Pentagon and getting briefed on America's nuclear war plans and walking out saying, that's insane. That's bat bleep crazy. We're not going to do that. And they kept telling the nuclear establishment to change the way we approach nuclear conflict. The nuclear establishment cannot change the way we approach nuclear conflict. That's just the reality of it. Nuclear weapons that we are addicted to result in one thing and one thing only, and it's the total annihilation of all mankind on the face of the earth. There's no such thing as limited nuclear war. You cannot contain nuclear conflict. Once a nuclear weapon is used against another nuclear power, they will use their nuclear weapons against us. It will lead to a retaliation until everybody on the planet is dead. Now, in the 1960s, we sort of began to realize that what we're doing is A, expensive, and B, pretty stupid. We're spending all this money to build these weapons that aren't defending us because if we use them, we die. And the Russians, the Soviets, then were doing the same thing. So they came up with this concept called arms control. How do we control this dragon, this beast that we've unleashed? And initially, what they had to do is just slow the pell-mell race to the abyss, because we were like a bunch of lemmings just going straight to the cliff. Nothing's going to stop us. We're heading that direction. One of the first things that they contemplated was what was happening, you see, is we'd build this missile. Then the Russians would build a missile to shoot it down. So we'd say, let's build a missile with more warheads. The Russians would build a lot more missiles to shoot it down. We'd say, let's build missiles with warheads and decoys. And they build missiles to shoot down. Meanwhile, they're building a missile And we say, well, we built one to shoot you down. They say, oh, yeah, really? Here's our missile with more warheads. Well, we got more missiles over here to shoot them down. And it was this arms race going on. And both sides were just basically running out of money. And so they came up with this unique concept called, let's just be honest about what we're doing here, guys, mutually assured destruction. You see, we're just going to agree that if you use nukes, we all die, let's not use nukes. But we're still going to build them. But we're going to constrain the kinds we build because we're no longer to build anti-ballistic missile systems. We're not going to build the missiles that shoot them down. We're not going to play that game. We're not going to pretend that there's a defense. We have nuclear weapons. You have nuclear weapons. But we both acknowledge that if we use them, we all die. So we're not going to build these anti-ballistic missile sites to defend against them. And that slowed the arms race down. And then we came up with the concept of strategic arms limitation, not reduction, a limitation to slow the rate of increase so that it's not out of control. And so the SALT talks, that's right. And so we started the SALT talks in the early 70s, and they went through the entire decade of SALT 1, then SALT 2 in the late 70s. And the idea again was how to limit the growth of nuclear weapons. This was very successful. But in the midst of the SALT talks, something happened. Another weapons class came into being called the Intermediate Nuclear Force, INF. You see, because when you're in the military, everything has to have a classification. We can't just call it a rocket. Now, Marines we do because we're not sophisticated enough to understand the difference between a little rocket and well, we know that's a little rocket, that's a medium rocket, that's a big rocket. The Air Force guys are smarter. They say, no, that's a short-range rocket. This is an intermediate-range rocket, and that's a long-range rocket. The intermediate-range rocket goes from 500 miles to 5,500 miles. That's the range differentiation. And what's important about that is that's the rocket that, when deployed to Europe, it was very popular because the Russians used INF systems because they could put their weapons further back into Russia and still reach into European targets. And then we had some systems that could reach into Russian targets. And they were older systems, and they weren't as effective. They took a long time to fuel, a long time to get prepared. And the idea is if you even began to launch them, they'd detect them, then they'd blow them up. Well, the Russians went, well, we're not playing that game anymore. Let me introduce you to something called the SS-20. SS-20 is a road mobile missile, solid fuel, so it fires that quick. There's no fueling up, with 3 nuclear warheads on it. And they deployed it in the 1970s, and Europe and the United States went, whoa, wait a minute. We ain't got nothing to respond to this. And the Russians went, that's not our problem. Welcome to my little friend, the SS-20. And the United States and Europe said, well, we got to respond to this. The Europeans are going, well, how do you want to respond to this? We want to put our own intermediate nuclear forces into Europe. The Europeans meant, so you're going to turn Europe into one big nuclear target. The United States said, yes, that's what we want to do. And the Europeans had this huge, anybody alive in the late 1970s, early 1980s will remember the anti-nuclear movement. It was massive. It brought down the German government. That's how big it was. The anti-nuclear protests were huge. But in the end, NATO and the United States won out, and we deployed 2 classes of nuclear weapons into Europe. The the Pershing II missile and the ground launch cruise missile. The Pershing II is interesting because it's a solid rocket system, once fired from West Germany, could reach Moscow in 5 to 7 minutes. Why is that important? Well, see, before that, if we fired, say, a Minuteman missile from the United States to get to the Soviet territory, it would take about 35, 40 minutes. That's enough time that if there was a mistake, a flock of birds set off a radar that simulated an ICBM assault, anything, a mistake, and the Russians are sitting in their command post going, holy beep, the Americans just launched on us. They got 30 to 40 minutes for someone to get on the phone, the hotline, to Washington saying, why did you launch on us? And America had a chance to say, we didn't launch on you. We just got a radar hit. Got a radar hit. No, it's a mistake. Flock of birds, stand down. Everybody stands down and the world doesn't end. That's a good thing. But with the Pershing II, 5 to 7 minutes, you don't even have time to make the phone call. We got a Pershing II launch. Fire. Oh, wait, that was a mistake. Well, that's too bad because we just fired our nukes. War ends. That's what the reality was in the 1980s. We lived on the cusp of nuclear annihilation. And this isn't theoretical, ladies and gentlemen. In 1983, NATO held an exercise called Able Archer, 83, linked to the year. It was a nuclear command post exercise where we were testing the launch release mechanisms so NATO could release nuclear weapons in a time of war. Now, we ran this exercise at the tail end of something called Reforger, Return of Forces to Germany. Massive exercise. See, at that time, we had around 300,000 American troops in West Germany. And if the Russians came across the border, we would then begin to surge in reinforcements. Within 10 days, we could fly in 250,000 more troops. They'd marry up with pre-positioned equipment, and they'd be ready to fight the Soviets before they got to the Rhine River. Reforger. And we ran a Reforger exercise. We pumped in around 60,000 more troops. So we got a lot of troops in Germany now, a lot of airplanes. We're on full alert, and we're running a command post exercise about the release of nuclear weapons. And the Soviets are going, this sounds like a preemptive nuclear strike. They got all their stuff there. They're ready to go. And if we're not careful, they're going to hit us with nuclear weapons. And then they're going to attack us. So the Soviets went on high alert. They put airplanes on strips with nuclear bombs underneath them, pilot in the cockpit, engine running, ready to launch on a moment's notice. That SS-20 missile force I talked about, high alert. The missiles are all out of their barracks in a combat deployment zone, ready to fire on a moment's notice. One mistake, ladies and gentlemen, and none of us would be here today. None of us would be here today. We were that close to everybody dying. Fortunately, no mistakes were made, and it stood down. But a couple months later, Ronald Reagan was being briefed by the CIA about this situation. They said, yeah, boss, back when we did that Able Archer 83 thing, man, apparently the Soviets thought we were going to attack them, and they all went on high alert. And Reagan went, what? What do you mean? The Soviets didn't think we're going to attack them. They couldn't be that stupid, could they? They said, yo, boss, they thought that we were going to attack them. And he said, that's insane. Smartest thing Ronald Reagan ever said. That's insane. But he didn't just say, he then acted on it. He said, we have to get rid of these weapons. Now we're talking about Ronald Wilson Reagan, the man who called the Soviet Union the evil empire, this ultra-conservative, communist-hating SOB is saying, this is insane. We got to get rid of these weapons. Had trouble because the Soviet counterparts that he was dealing with weren't inclined to be so benevolent. Brezhnev died after being in power for a number of decades, replaced by a guy named Andropov, who was a former KGB head, but he got cancer and died early on. So they instead put a guy named Chernenko, who could barely breathe. He was so old. He stayed a couple months and he died. And the question is, are they going to put another old dinosaur in place or somebody new? The answer was somebody new. Mikhail Gorbachev stood up in his 50s, young man, dynamic. And Gorbachev said, I'm going to be the leader. Not just the leader, I'm going to be the guy that changes things. We're not going to deal with the stagnation of the Brezhnev period. We're going to try and bring the Soviet Union out of the stagnation into a leading edge country. We're going to make meaningful changes, one of which is we have to reduce the amount of spending that we have on strategic nuclear forces. We need to embrace arms control to bring control over our defense spending. And here we got Ronald Reagan saying what? He wants to get rid of INF weapons? Let's talk to him about this. And they began a discussion, a dialogue. In the 1980s, things weren't that good. I look around here in the room, and I'm guessing a lot of you, like me, were alive as adults in the 1980s. So if I told you at that time that relations between the United States and Soviet Union were pretty bad, you'd know what I'm talking about. Hundreds of thousands of troops facing off along a border, a hostile border in Germany, ready to go to war on a moment's notice. The United States funding through proxy, a war in Afghanistan, the sole purpose of which was to kill Soviet soldiers. The Soviets shooting Americans operating in East Germany who were trying to spy on a tank facility. Major Arthur Nicholson, may his name never be forgotten, shot in 1985 out of Ludwigshafen, trying to do his job on monitoring Soviet tank units, killed by a Soviet sentry. Things were pretty bad. Able Archer almost went to war. There was a couple more times where we almost went to nuclear war. Things weren't good in the 1980s, ladies and gentlemen. But somehow, two leaders found it in their hearts to sit down at a table and sign a treaty that got rid of the weapons that were threatening Europe and the world with imminent nuclear annihilation. That treaty was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. On December 8th of this year is the 35th anniversary. 35 years have gone past since a moment of clarity and sanity that took place at a time when the United States and the Soviet Union were not getting along. And the reason why they bring that up is a lot of people today, and we'll get to this in a second, talk about the relations today between the United States and Russia. They say it's never been this bad. I said, you weren't alive in the 80s then, were you? Because it was that bad in the 80s. Maybe even worse. But we found a way out. And that way was arms control, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And that's the second book I wrote, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union. It's sort of a quasi-autobiography, because how do you tell a story that you played an important role in without making yourself part of the story? I mean, but you have to be careful, because on the one hand, it can end up being all about, hey, look at me, I'm great, I'm God's gift, this is a book all about me, nothing I did was wrong. Well, that would be fun to write, wouldn't be true, and it might not be a very good book. But this, I had to insert myself, and that's why at the bottom it says a personal journal. Because when you read the book, you'll see, as a junior officer, I was given an opportunity to do something of great responsibility. When I was in college, I was a Russian history major. Why? Well, because I was going to join the Marine Corps. To do what? Kill a commie for mommy. Don't chuckle. That was a real thing we said back then, and we meant it. Better dead than red. Not a joke, ladies and gentlemen. Die before you become communist. My father's a career Air Force officer, a Cold Warrior, served in Vietnam, served on the front line of the Cold War throughout the world. I was raised in that environment, and my mindset was, I am going to join the military, and I'm going to defend my country and its allies from the communist threat. I'm going to join the Marine Corps because it is a cutting-edge, most lethal fighting force known to mankind. We tell ourselves that every day, whether it's true or not. We are brainwashed. But I was going to join the Marine Corps. I was going to kill Russians. If you're going to kill Russians, you got to know your enemy. So I studied Russian history. I studied the Russian language. I played football and I drank beer at the same time. Put two and two together. If you play football and drink beer and study the Russian language, one of those things gets to drop off the priorities. The Russian language. Unfortunately, that ended up being on my resume. It said Scott Ritter is a Russian history major who had 2 years of college Russian. So when they signed this treaty, I was off in 29 Palms learning how to kill Russians. Very well, by the way. We were very good at what we did. Theoretically, we never had the opportunity to do it, but I was waiting for the opportunity. Never came. Why? Reagan and Gorbachev signed that damn treaty. And suddenly the Marine Corps, instead of sending me off in a unit to close with and destroy the Russian enemy through firepower and maneuver, repel their attack through close combat and assault, nope. I'm being told, pack your bags, son. You're going to the Soviet Union as a weapons inspector. I said, what? I get to kill people? Nope. You get to inspect weapons. I wasn't trained to do that. I had no experience in that. I had no qualifications whatsoever, except my resume said, Russian history major, speaks Russian. You see, the Marine Corps is tasked with probably 4 people. Colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors. I was a newly promoted first lieutenant. Anybody been in the military understands what that means. When you take a first lieutenant and you put him in a room full of majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels, the first thing they're all saying is, hey, lieutenant, where's the coffee? Because that's all you're qualified to do, get the coffee. And that's literally what happened. The day I showed up at the headquarters, I was in this room with 80 people, majors, lieutenant colonels, colonels. The general came in, and a major, an Air Force major, came out and said, hey, where's the coffee? I said, I have no idea, and I ain't getting it for you either, because you're wearing blue, I'm wearing green. Get out of my face. But I did do that. That's why I didn't make high rank. Not very politically astute. But the point is, when they were looking for, they got the colonel, one of the best men I've ever met in my life. I dedicated the book to him, Colonel George Connell, Silver Star winner in Vietnam, got highly decorated for his work in Moscow in the defense attaché, doing espionage against the Soviet target, man of great integrity. And he's the kind of guy that they brought in who made peace with the Russians. A man who prepared for war, waged war, and made peace with the Russians. And that book's dedicated to him. But so Connell, they got another colonel, lieutenant colonel, Pulumyote Kelly, we called him. Larry Kelly, again, Vietnam War veteran pilot who not only was an outstanding pilot, he became an instructor pilot, but then he volunteered to be on the ground as a foreign air controller with infantry companies in combat, calling into airstrikes. And he saw a lot of men die. He saved a lot of men because of his heroism. He was in East Germany when Major Arthur Nicholson was shot. He was one of the first guys to the scene, took control of the body. While they were negotiating the release of the body, he stayed with it overnight. The Soviets were trying to do an autopsy. He wouldn't allow the autopsy. He stood between the body and the guards and said, "You have to go through me to get to that body." And he stared him down. And then when they brought the body back to Berlin, anybody see that movie with Tom Hanks, Bridge of Spies? Well, that bridge is real. And when they brought the body back, he stopped the ambulance and put the American flag on the casket. Made him come home as a hero. Larry Kelly, hell of a guy, good man. Then they ran out of Marines. They were like, "We need a major. We ain't got any majors. We need a captain." None. We got a lieutenant, Ritter. He speaks Russian, apparently. So they brought me in. I show up, and they say, "Well, what are you here to do?" I say, "I don't know." "Well, you want to be an inspector?" "I guess so." "Okay, we're going to put you on our team." "All right." "Okay, go home, get cleaned up, come back tomorrow, we'll start." As I'm walking out the building, Larry Kelly shows up and locks me up. That's what lieutenant colonels do to lieutenants. "Lieutenant, sir." And he starts hitting me with Russian. They called him Pulumyote for a reason, because his Russian was fast and it was precise, and I didn't understand a single word of it. And he's, and I said, "I'm sorry, sir, could you repeat yourself slowly, please? Because I didn't understand you." He said, "You don't speak Russian worth a damn." I said, "Never claimed to." He said, "You're fired." Fired me on the spot. "You're fired. You're an embarrassment to the Marine Corps." These are direct quotes. "An embarrassment to the Marine Corps, an embarrassment to the uniform. Get out of here. We're going to send you back to the fleet. You're not doing this job. I don't know why they sent you here." And I said, "I don't know either. All I want to do is kill them. And now you want me to talk to them, and I can't because I don't speak the language. Never claimed to." Well, the way things work is, it takes time for you to get fired, apparently. And the Marine Corps leadership abhors a vacuum. Anybody who's been in the Marine Corps knows that. Marines will sit around, and if there's something to be done and no one's doing it, the Marines are going to go do it, because we just don't sit around and wait for it. And I ended up filling vacuums while I was being waited to transfer out. One of the vacuums I filled was to become the head of counterintelligence. The head of counterintelligence. That's a job that's supposed to be run by a senior FBI agent. And he came in, he checked in, he said, "Okay, I'm here, but I have to go back and get out of the FBI. It's going to take me about 2 months to get out of the FBI. So vacant spot." That's okay, because they got an Air Force colonel, full-bird colonel, who's supposed to be the deputy. And he showed up. He was ready to do it, but he had to go back to Germany to get his family ready to move back in here and all that. Empty seat. They said, "Well, who do we got?" "Well, we just fired Ritter." "Ritter, come here. Son, you're the head of counterintelligence for the on-site inspection agency to implement the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty." I said, "What do I do?" "Don't worry about it, boy. Sit behind the desk. When the phone rings, answer it. Take a message for the big boys when they come back. That's all we want you to do. Answer the phone, take a message, big boys return, we get to fire you, you go away." "Yes, sir, I can do that." Sit down, phone rings. "Yeah, this is the head of the National Security Agency. We have a meeting tomorrow to discuss counterinsurgency implementation for when the Soviets arrive at this base. What message do you want?" "Son, I don't want you to take a message. Somebody's got to show up at that meeting." That was me. So I showed up at the meeting, and everybody's looking at me going, "What are we doing?" I said, "I don't know." "What do you want to do?" "Well, we have to do counterintelligence." I said, "What is counterintelligence?" And they explained it to me and all that. I started writing papers. I wrote pretty good papers. I wrote the entire, what they call essential elements of information of counterintelligence. So when the Soviets come in, how do we prepare to receive them, what we're looking for. I built training programs of each of the factories in the United States so that when the Soviet inspectors showed up, there was a plan on how to receive them, how to implement the treaty. I'm a first lieutenant, doing all this stuff. And then they introduced me to this place called Vodkinsk. I'm going, "What is Vodkinsk?" Well, Vodkinsk, ladies and gentlemen, was the place where those SS-20 missiles were built. And The idea of the treaty was to get rid of all these missiles. It's supposed to be easy. You declare them, we blow them up, that's it. The problem is about a month before the treaty was implemented, the Russians went, oh yeah, we forgot to tell you something about the SS-20. The first stage is the same as the SS-25 that's produced at the same factory. And we're like, well, wait a minute, if it's the same stage, how do we know that the SS-25s coming out aren't SS-20s disguised? See, arms control verification requires verification. And if you're producing a missile that has the same first stage, how do we verify that it's not a prohibited missile? And the solution was to put a monitoring system outside that factory. 30 Americans were going to live and work outside this factory full time, monitoring the production and using various technical means to determine whether or not the missile canister came out, had an SS-25 or an SS-20 in it. And I'm the counterintelligence guy going, wow, we got 30 Americans going to live outside of a missile factory in the middle of the Soviet Union. Sounds like a counterintelligence problem to me. Sounds like the Soviets could recruit these 30 Americans. We have to do something to deal with that because I'm a first lieutenant and I know everything. I know nothing. But you know that, anybody watch Game of Thrones? You know nothing, Jon Snow. Well, I'm literally Jon Snow, but they gave me a job to do and I'm going to do it. I ended up going up to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, briefing him on the problem. The thing is, when you walk in and you say, I run counterintelligence for the on-site inspection agency, they're not looking at a rank. They're saying, okay, that's your job description. You have a job to do it. You want to do this? Let's do it. So I built a polygraph program so that every inspector that would go over to the Soviet Union, after they had contact with the Soviet target, would come back with a mandatory counterintelligence scope polygraph to make sure the Soviets hadn't recruited them. This is something that we do all the time when there's people with security clearances having close and continuous contact with the Soviets. So I built a program. I just thought that's what I was supposed to do. Then the FBI guy comes back. He says, hey, Ritter, what's going on? And I show him when he goes, holy cow, you basically built the program. I said, yes, sir. There's no one here to do it. I built it. He said, wow, this is a good job. Hey, what's this thing over here? I said, oh yeah, this is the pride of my joy. This is my counterintelligence. This is my polygraph program. I'm so proud of this baby, got it approved and everything. He said, what the hell have you done here? He says, does the general know about this? I said, no, I'm the head of counterintelligence. He said, he's the head of the agency. He's your boss. You haven't told the general that you've signed us up for a polygraph program? Was I supposed to? Said, yeah, dip, beep. So I get called in, and it's not just me and the FBI guy and the general. It's this colonel named Doug England. He's the counterpart to George Connell, the other guy I dedicated this book to. See, Doug and George were the two colonels that were selected to go and create this Vodkinsk portal monitoring facility. That was their baby. Nothing happens about that without their knowledge and permission. They're in charge. And I just built a polygraph program that's going to polygraph every single American that goes over there, and they knew nothing about it. So I'm in there in front of the general, and they're going to fire me. But this time I really earned it. They're going to fire me. They might even court-martial me. The only problem is, you see, in my genius as a first lieutenant, in building this program, I said, we need people to implement the program. So I argued, the whole time the general's saying, I need more inspectors, I need more inspectors, I need more inspectors. And the Department of Defense saying, you can't have any more inspectors. We've given you everybody you got. Well, I went up there and I said, this counterintelligence program, I need 3 guys to implement it. They went, sure, Scott, we'll give you 3 bodies. So I had 3 bodies attached to the polygraph program. And now they're sitting there going, holy cow. Hey, Connell, England, the 2 colonels, you've been begging for more bodies. Ritter just got you 3 bodies. 3 bodies. We can't fire them. So they canceled the polygraph program, but they kept it alive long enough to get the 3 bodies. But what happened there is Colonel England, he said, what do you do, Ritter? I said, well, I'm the head of counterintelligence. He said, well, I don't like the fact that you're running around doing stuff that I'm not aware of. So you're body number 1. Of the 3 bodies, you're it. Your new job, counterintelligence, Vodkinsk. Not only that, son, you're going to Russia. Advanced party. I was the first inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union. Little side story, just to have some humor here. Larry Kelly found out. Remember the guy that fired me because I can't speak Russian worth a damn? I'm a disgrace in the Marine Corps in the service, and I should be drummed out, tarred and feathered, and burned. He found out and he went, oh my God, they're sending you to the Soviet Union. It's okay. Don't worry. Don't panic. We're going to give you a 2-week immersive language training at the Defense Language Center in Washington, D.C. You're going to do your job in the morning. In the afternoon, you're going to Washington, D.C., and you're going to spend 4 hours a day for 2 straight weeks immersed in Russian language. And they introduced me to this most wonderful Russian immigrant woman. She was beautiful. She was smart. She taught me Russian, and she cried the day I graduated. Tears not of joy, of shame. She said, I have betrayed my country because I was supposed to teach you Russian and you can't speak Russian worth a damn. And she was right. And I got sent off to the Soviet Union, not knowing a word of Russian. But what I did find out there is that this treaty that we're being asked to implement was going to be a son of a gun. The rest of the treaty that they had negotiated, everything had been figured out. Every protocol, every piece of gear, anything is all laid out in the treaty the way it's supposed to be, so there's no questions. See, when you have a treaty, there can be no questions. It's all laid out, it's all spelled out. All you do is implement that which the treaty tells you to implement. But because at the last second they decide to put this monitoring facility, the most complicated piece of arms control infrastructure ever envisioned, they didn't have any protocols. They didn't have anything. And they said, well, you guys just go figure it out. Well, you guys figuring it out was me, first lieutenant, and a bunch of other guys showing up going, what do we do? You have to build this thing. And the Soviets who were receiving us going, what do you want to do? We got to build this thing. Where in the treaty does it get us right? No, we get to make it up as we go along. So we started working cooperatively with these Soviets in a cooperative fashion. And okay. Wow, we haven't got to Ukraine yet. I'm sitting here telling war stories. What the hell? We're going to stick with arms control and we can deal with Ukraine in the question and answer. What do you think about that? That fair? All right. So we're trying to build it because this is important, ladies and gentlemen. What I'm saying, it's not just a story. This is important. We're building this facility that nobody ever considered should be built. There was no plan to build it. The conditions that we're building under are outrageous. You've heard of General Mud. They talk about it right now in Ukraine. The tanks get disappeared in mud. It's called the Rasputitsa. See, I learned a couple words. And it's the muddy season. And when they mean muddy season, they mean muddy season. We're talking about the dusty roads becoming knee-deep in mud. The mud is everywhere. You're tasting the mud because it's in your mouth. It shuts everything down. But fortunately, in that part of Russia, close to Siberia, the Rasputitsa only lasts a couple weeks because then it gets cold. And when I say cold, I know you guys are like, Michigan, Scott, we know cold. You don't know cold. Cold is minus 50, minus 70 without a wind chill factor. Cold is when you bring a forklift off an airplane, it gets to go 10 meters before it freezes solid. So in order for us to move equipment from an airplane to a truck, we had to build warming tents and literally bring the forklift from one warming tent to the next warming tent to the next warming tent, put it on the truck, bring it back. And the guys that were doing this were from the U.S. Air Force Elite Arctic Weather Transportation Squadron. Son, we fly in Norway. We fly in the Arctic Circle. I said, you ain't flying in Russia. It's a different beast in Russia, and they agreed afterwards. They issued this thing called the Mickey Mouse boot. Anybody in the military knows it, the vapor barrier boot. Vapor barrier boot can keep your feet warm in up to degrees, up to minus 20. When it's minus 50, your feet freeze. So the issue, they don't have any boots to deal with that. Well, the Russians do. They have something called the Valinki. It's a felt boot, simple felt. There's no high tech. It's felt this thick. You put it on, you take newspapers and you wrap it around and your feet are toasty warm. So we started wearing Valinki because that's the only way we could operate in the wintertime. The military issues these flimsy little hats. They don't work. Your ears freeze. So we go buy the nice Russian shapkas, fur hats, man, where our heads are toasty, our feet are toasty. Our coats don't work, so we go buy the Russian coats. Well, in December, we're going to take a team photograph outside the factory with the American flag. And we all get there and we hold the American flag up. And we're like, yeah, America. Take the picture, send it to the general. He goes, why the hell are the Soviets posing with an American flag? We said, well, no, we're Americans, but you don't give us equipment that works. So they had to learn how to give us new equipment. We were banned from wearing the Valinki and the hats and all that stuff. We had to wear special American equipment. It never kept us warm, by the way. But what it did do is we created this bond with the Soviets. One of the best moments of my inspection experience took place on Christmas or on New Year's Eve on December 31st, 1989, or 88, I'm sorry. There's a guy I was working with, Yegor Yefremov, and he was a guy who used to build missiles that were aimed at America. And now his job is to work with us to get rid of the missiles that he built that were aimed at America. It's a tough thing because they're going through this very difficult program, perestroika, the demilitarization of their industry, et cetera. They're running out of money, things are tight. But on New Year's Eve, he invited me and a couple other Americans to his home. And it was one of the most eye-opening experiences. Because remember, when I said I was training to kill Russians, I meant it. That's not a joke, ladies and gentlemen. War isn't a joke. And what we were training to do isn't a joke. But if you're training to kill people, you're either a sociopath or you're somebody who had to condition yourself to be a sociopath. And what that means is you have to dehumanize your enemy. You can't think of them as fellow human beings. You think of them as animate objects that deserve to die. And now I'm being invited to the home of one of these animate objects that deserve to die. And I find out that he's a father. He's a husband. He has friends who like him. He loves his children. His children love him. They tell jokes. They tell funny jokes. They laugh. They cry. They get angry. They get happy. They're human beings. They are just like me. They speak a different language. They have a little bit of a different cultural background. But at the end of the day, they are fellow human beings who are on a journey to trying to make the world safer. And they're working with me and other Americans to get it done, regardless of the political difficulties our two governments might have. The treaty was the unifying experience. Buy the book if you want to know how difficult this was. It was very difficult. It was also very entertaining. Anybody who's been involved in close-knit groups in very tense situations understands that humor becomes a bedrock moment. I'll give you one example. Okay, I'll use the example, but I'll guard my language. We were watching them build the housing that we were going to live in. We lived in the middle of the city for several months until they finished the quarters. The guy who's responsible for it is named Chernyenko, great man. And every morning he'd get his military construction guys together and they'd gather around and he'd give them this speech. We're going to build the building today. We're going to do this. We're pouring this much concrete. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. 1, 2, 3. Raza, 3. Zayabis. And I'm like, that's a cheer. It's a cheer. I got it. They're cheering. So I went up there and I said, what does Zayabis mean? He said, he's a little embarrassed. Work together strongly. I said, all right, I like that. Well, the generals come in and they bring us up to the dacha. And they brought me, I'm junior, but they said, the Soviet general said, hey, we got Colonel Connell, Marine. We have another Marine here, Larry Shively, the chief of staff here. And there's another Marine in the site, Ritter. Say, yeah, but he's a first lieutenant. No, bring Ritter. I want all 3 Marines here. All right, so I'm sitting there at the big table with the big boys. And it comes time for toasts. And everybody's coming up, I want to drink to Soviet-American fraternal friendship. Drink to that. It goes all the way around. They come to me and they go, Ritter, you got a toast? And my colonels are going, no. The general goes, yeah, I want to hear Ritter's toast. Well, general wants, general gets. So I stand up and I say, I've been touched by the way Americans and Soviets work together and the very principles of unity and comradeship, et cetera. So I want to give a toast based upon a cheer that I hear every morning. I point to Chernyenko. And he's like, every morning, Colonel Chernyenko gets his troops together and he says this, and Chernyenko's face is like, no. He's waving me off. And I'm like, I don't understand. So I said, so, Journal, to you, Zayabis. Silence. Silence. And the Americans are just like, oh, God, what did you just say? I'm like, I don't know. Work hard, strong together. I don't know. And finally, the General Medvedev starts laughing. And then once he laughed, all the Russians start laughing. They're just falling down laughing. He stands up and says, I'll drink to that. Zayabis. And all that. And so we're walking out afterwards, and Colonel Connell grabs me. What the hell are you doing? I said, I don't know, sir. I was giving a toast. Do you know what you just said? I said, yeah, work strong together. And he said, no, this is the first time in my military career that a goddamn first lieutenant stood up and told a general to fuck off. I'm like, whoa. But that became a rallying cry. That toast Zaya Beast was used throughout our time in Vodkits. Anytime we came up with a very difficult situation and we overcame it, we'd all get together and say Zaya Beast. It's a horrible word, but it became to mean something much different. It was a comradeship thing, and that's the story I want to tell. And I don't want to just tell it because it's a good story. I want to tell it for this following reason. Today we're looking at a situation in Ukraine where the United States and Russia are at odds. There's a potential for conflict. Americans don't like Russians, Russians don't like Americans, and there the two shall meet. And people keep asking, how do we bring this to an end? How do we stop this conflict? And right now, nobody has an answer. Nobody has an answer. That book's the answer right there, ladies and gentlemen. It's a template. George Santayana, American philosopher, said, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. But the implication in that is that the lessons of history are always negative lessons, condemned to repeat it. I'll give you a modification of that. Those who fail to learn the successes of history are condemned to never be able to repeat it. And that is a success of history, ladies and gentlemen. The implementation of the INF Treaty took place at a time when relations between Russia and the Soviet Union and the United States were bad as they are today. And yet, through the vehicle of arms control, we found a mechanism that we stopped wanting to kill each other and we started working together with each other and we ended up liking each other. The notion of peaceful coexistence is alive and well and breathing in that book. That book is a template of hope because the way we're going to get out of this problem today is through arms control. We're going to get out of it by negotiating a new arms control treaty that reduces the threshold of potential for nuclear strike down to as close to zero as possible. People say that's impossible. That's a dream. It can't happen. It did happen. That book is the history of how it happened. And if you read that book, you'll say, my God, we have hope for the future. And on that, I thank you very much for coming, and I'll take any questions anybody has about anything. I warned you about the sugar, guys.
Thank you. If you'd like to raise your hand, I'll bring the mic over. And just to let everyone know, as the questions start to come out, more and more questions come out. We want to be mindful of time. If you can please keep your questions short and limited. What we hope we can do, we still have enough time to. Yeah, I'm not sure how much time exactly it will take to get the question out. But again, please be respectful with your questions. There will also be time, I think, to discuss and mingle afterwards. So we'll keep things moving along here. But yes, we'll start with the first question here.
Okay, so my question is, I read a report that because so much money and weapons are being pumped into Ukraine, that is causing NATO stockpile to lessen, and they're having a hard time, rearming NATO, the NATO countries. What does that development mean to the arms race? Is that good that they have less weapons, or what do you think the consequences are going to be with regards to that?
Well, normally when we speak about arms race, we're talking about nuclear arms race. We don't necessarily talk about the conventional arms race, although there is an aspect to it. We need to understand a couple things. One, when the Cold War ended, the United States stopped thinking in terms of large-scale ground combat in Europe. We went from 300,000 troops to within 10 years having 60,000 troops. We went from having tens of thousands of tanks to somewhere in the mid-2000s having 0 tanks. We also got involved in fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. And our mindset, our focus there was on low-intensity conflict, counterinsurgency warfare, not large-scale ground combat in Europe. So we stopped building and training and preparing for war in Europe, and we did so in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, as difficult as that fighting was, let me tell you a couple things. We don't use that much artillery. We fire a couple rounds, that's it. The reason why I'm bringing up artillery, because this is a major component of the kind of aid that we're providing to Ukrainians today. HIMARS, the high mobility artillery rocket system, the M777 155 millimeter artillery system, Then NATO is providing M109s, American-designed howitzers, various configurations, 155 millimeter howitzers there, and other systems that use the 155 millimeter shell. I keep bringing up that 155 millimeter shell because it's very important. In the Gulf War, Desert Storm, the war I fought in, the United States fired 60,000 artillery rounds for the entire conflict, and that was a lot. The Russians, ladies and gentlemen, in this current conflict are firing 60,000 rounds a day. A day. Ukraine is able at its max to get around 20,000 rounds out a day. The United States, because of the reconfiguration of our military and post-Cold War environment, have a ability, we have production lines that produce around 250,000 155 millimeter shells a year. That's 250,000, give or take, whatever. Now, I'm just a Marine. The math isn't too good, but 250,000 divided by 20 gives you roughly 10 days, 10.5 days of combat. And then it's over. You don't have any ammunition. Now, so we sent them these M777s, the howitzers. We send them other NATO howitzers, and we start sending them ammunition. And the Ukrainians are saying, thank you very much. Boom, 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 more ammo. Okay, give more ammo. Boom, 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 more ammo. Hey, sir, just a second. We're getting into our reserve stocks, war reserve stocks. We don't got any more ammo to give. If we give it to them, we won't be able to fight. Right now, we've given so much ammunition to Ukrainians, which they've expended, by the way. There ain't nothing left. We don't have any ammunition left to give them. The British, if they went to war today, will run out of ammunition in 2 days. If the United States goes to war today, we'll run out of ammunition between 10 and 14 days. That's how bad this has come. So what are the implications? One, we've got the Ukrainians addicted to a weapon system we can't support. We got them hooked on heroin, and now there's no heroin left to give them. Two, we don't have any heroin left to our own addictions. We don't have enough. This goes across the board. We are out of systems to give the Ukrainians. The burn rate, the destruction rate on the ground in combat, what's going on in Ukraine today is so high that virtually everything we've provided has been destroyed. And one last thing on that. When I say destroyed equipment, that attaches to it dead people. Let's never forget we're talking about war here. It's not academic. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives, Ukrainian and Russian. Primarily military, but civilian as well. And this war is going to continue, and hundreds of thousands more people are going to lose their lives. So when we think about what we're doing, understand we're feeding a cycle of violence whose output is dead bodies and destroyed equipment. And we have to ask ourselves, to what end? And if we're feeding them stuff that we can't sustain, it means we're not going to win. Ukraine is not going to win this war. They cannot win this war. They don't have the ability to win this war. We can't sustain the conflict with what we're providing. They've burned through all their Soviet era stuff. They're talking about putting up new production lines right now in the former Soviet republics. That's going to take a year, year and a half to do. Ukraine has lost this war. So now we have to ask ourselves, why are we then insisting on sending more aid to Ukraine? And we know the answer. No. Well, yeah, money, but the answer is, according to Lindsey Graham, esteemed Republican senator from the state of South Carolina, to fight to the last Ukrainian. And if that's your goal and objective, then shame on you, because that means you're willing to sacrifice the very people you claim you're doing this on behalf of. That's my answer.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm here for ending our war of terror for daily commerce. So how about linking up a new arms agreement with the remaining use of our fossil fuels? Lieutenant General Michael Flynn proposed something like that.
I am open. I mean, one of the interesting things I came here, and Mike and I were talking about how do we move forward from what we're doing here. And we talked about, potential for workshops to come together to build coalitions, to build teams, and come up with achievable objectives, etc. I'm all open to anything that is creative and that can win. I'm not in a position to speak intelligently about what you just said. I recognize the merits, and I think it should be explored. I'm not blowing off your question, but I can't answer something. I mean, I could sit up here and pretend that I was a politician running for election. Sir, I know so much about petroleum, and I don't know anything about it. So that's why I can't answer it.
You know something about the war of terror?
I do know something about the war of terror.
That's our organizing principle, isn't it?
Well, war is our organizing principle. Not whether it's against terror or against Russians or against little green Martians. America is a nation addicted to war. Our economy is built on the principles of a military-industrial complex whose money comes from Congress. So it's now the military-industrial congressional complex that Dwight D. Eisenhower warned us about in his farewell address when he left office.
Thank you for being in Ann Arbor today. That has been a fascinating talk. I have two very short questions for you, please. One is, do you think there is a role for Europe and the EU in the efforts to implement arms control, or do you think that this is mainly between the US and Russia? And my second question would be, what do you think it would take for the American government, or any American government, not necessarily this one, to be convinced to engage in arms control, and what the people can do about it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's start with the first part. I mean, already, let's talk about the categories of nuclear weapons that are in Europe. Okay, you have the French nuclear deterrence, you have the British nuclear submarine force, and then you have a whole bunch of B-61 nuclear bombs that are American, but we've designated them for use by NATO in combat. So nations that aren't necessarily nuclear powers, like Germany, the Netherlands, etc., have aircraft that have been designated as dual-use aircraft. The pilots in the aircraft are certified to deliver nuclear weapons. So in a time of conflict, these American nuclear bombs will be loaded on these European aircraft, and they'll be used to drop nuclear weapons on the Russians. So now, if you're a Russian and you're talking about arms control, logically, you'd like to include all these weapons because they're weapons that are aligned against you. The United States and NATO refuse to allow these weapons to be discussed in anything because this is NATO's nuclear umbrella. This is NATO's comfort zone. Without this, NATO will be convinced that the United States will flee Europe in a time of crisis and leave Europe to its own devices. So what is the role of Europe? And it's the same role that Europe had to come to grips with back in the 1980s. Understand that if you embrace nuclear weapons, you are embracing suicide. Because nuclear weapons, there is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. You can't just drop one. What was that commercial? You can't just eat one, you got to eat more. Well, nuclear weapons the same way. You can't just drop one, guys, you got to drop them all. You got to drop them all, because if you don't drop them all, they may hit you and you might lose them. So rather than wait and have some on the ground to get blown up by their nukes, just use them all up front. And so what is the role of Europe? Hopefully Europe is going to recognize that the current conflict and what's happening to Europe is solely because of American national security policy. America is not a friend of Europe. We claim to be, but we're not. Because we blow up Europe's $12 billion energy infrastructure. We blow up the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines. We're good friends. Why would we blow it up? So we can sell them liquid natural gas. Of course, because we're good friends, we're going to sell them at the market rate, right? No, we're going to let that price jack up so we make overwhelming what do they call it? Windfall profits. And so we're destroying the European economy, but that's okay. We'll subsidize it so they can keep their jobs at home. No, 1 in 4 German jobs are going to come to the United States next year because they can't afford to do business in Germany because of American policy, not Russian policy. We're good friends. Europe has to wake up to recognize that we're not their friend, that Europe, this nuclear umbrella, is a trap. It traps Europe into a system of NATO dependency, recognizing that NATO is nothing more than an arm of the American national security and foreign policy team, establishment. So Europe's going to have to free itself of the American addiction. Now, the second question dealt with arms control and how do we get to, what was it? Well, the American government is convinced about engaging. But here we go. On November 29th, the United States and Russia were supposed to meet in Cairo, Egypt, to discuss the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. See, it's sort of stymied right now. Why? Because those dirty Russians cheat. Nope, that's not why. It's because the Americans have sanctioned Russia to the extent that Russian inspectors cannot fly to the United States. So Russians are, even though they're allowed to, and it's required under the treaty to inspect American facilities, we won't let them in because we've sanctioned them. Meanwhile, we say, but you have to let us in. You can't come in, but we get to go in. And the Russians went, we ain't playing that game. So there won't be any inspections. So the Americans are like, well, wait a minute, we need to know what you're doing. So they want to have this meeting. Well, the Russians said, well, we'll meet, but then the last second they pulled out. Why? Well, Russians gave a statement. They said, how do you expect us to sit at the table with you when you've embraced a policy that's built around the notion of killing Russian soldiers by the thousands? How can we sit at the table with you when you embrace an economic sanctions policy that's designed to bring harm to the Russian people? Because that's what it is. It's not about sanctioning oligarchs and the leadership. It's about collapsing the Russian economy to create domestic political unrest so people rise up and overthrow Vladimir Putin. We want to bring harm to the Russian people, and the Russian government saying, if that's your policy, we can't sit with you at the table. So how do we get arms control? We have to start treating the Russians with respect. We have to believe that when we enter an agreement, they have to believe when they enter an agreement with us that we will honor the agreement, we will implement the agreement, that we will treat them with the same deference that we expect them to treat us. We're not doing that today because we live in a nation that has been pre-programmed with Russophobic, undertones to treat at face value anything negative said about Russia. Not to disrespect anybody in this room, but we have personalized Russia into the figure of one man. A nation of 158 million people, all we know is Vladimir Putin. Putin did it. Putin's bad. Putin's evil. Putin's awful. Putin. If you're a Russian, you're embarrassed. You're saying, guys, we're a little bit more complicated than that, than one man. But that's all we know, and we don't even get him right. We don't even get him right. You can't solve a problem unless you accurately define the problem, and we're defining the problem of Russia as Putin, and we expect to get the solution correct? No, we have to learn about Russia, we have to respect Russia, and then we can engage with Russia.
With that, unfortunately, we're out of time for collective group questions, but there is enough time that we can have a chance to converse with Scott one-on-one. Please join me in thanking Scott for giving us that valuable information.
Thank you.